The wind whispered across the barren desert as dusk settled over the camp. Flames from the fire flickered against worn boots and weathered faces, casting long shadows on the dusty ground. Laughter echoed among the cowboys, loud, crude, and careless. They leaned on their saddlebags and whiskey bottles, mocking the lone Apache sitting silently at the edge of the fire. He had barely spoken since sunrise, just nodded once or twice, eyes always watching, always listening. To them, he was nothing but another quiet savage, stoic, reserved, mysterious in that way native men always were. But what none of them knew was that this silent man carried a secret, one so shocking that it would freeze every tongue around that fire when revealed. In the Old West, silence could be mistaken for weakness, and to these cowboys, pride was a louder virtue than respect. They poked fun, called him names in slurred tones, threw half-burnt wood his way. The bishop, a visiting man of the cloth riding with them to the next outpost, observed in awkward silence, unsure whether to scold or stay neutral. But the Apache remained unmoved, not with fear, not with rage, just with an uncanny calmness that unsettled the air. Every insult was met with nothing more than a blink, a breath, a subtle glance at the stars above. Something in his stillness demanded reverence, but the men were too blind with arrogance to see it. As the night deepened and the fire roared stronger, stories of war, betrayal, and conquest filled the camp. The bishop began quoting scriptures in Latin, proudly, with a voice polished by seminary years. The cowboys, of course, didn't understand a word. They clapped and hollered anyway, pretending to grasp his meanings. That's when it happened. A quiet voice, deep and smooth as river stone, broke through the laughter, replying fluently, flawlessly in Latin. Every head snapped in the same direction. The Apache wasn't looking at the cowboys. He was looking directly at the bishop, and he was speaking as though he had been raised inside the very Vatican halls. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't born of arrogance or mockery. It was filled with awe. Every man there realized they had not just underestimated a fellow traveler. They had mocked a man who spoke the language of empires, of scholars, of saints, and perhaps most terrifying of all, they had no idea what else he might know, or where he had learned it. The desert was suddenly colder. The fire no longer felt safe. The bishop, now visibly shaken, asked the Apache how he knew Latin. The answer he received would forever change how they all saw not just the man, but their own place in the world. This is not just a story about ignorance and pride. It's about what happens when the voice you least expect to speak teaches you the lesson of a lifetime. The fire crackled as the weight of silence pressed down on the camp. The cowboys, rough men shaped by dust, whiskey, and war, sat frozen in disbelief. The Apache, still as stone moments ago, now spoke with the poise of an old-world scholar. Latin flowed from his lips like a hymn, his tone measured, reverent. The bishop's eyes widened, and his jaw trembled, as if he had seen a ghost. No one moved. Not even the wind dared interrupt the sacred stillness that had settled upon them. One of the younger cowboys, barely more than a boy, whispered, "Did he just speak Latin?" But no one answered. Even the loudest of the bunch, known as Buckshot Bill, who had just been tossing jokes at the Apache's expense, couldn't find his voice. In that moment, the hierarchy of the camp dissolved. This was no longer a circle of cowboys with a silent outsider. This was a reckoning with ignorance, and with something far older than the West, a language of faith, knowledge, and power. The Apache's eyes held steady, fixed on the bishop. There was no mockery in them, no triumph, only calm wisdom, as if he'd seen this before, many times, in many places. The bishop, startled from his trance, managed to respond in Latin, though not as confidently. They exchanged a few more lines, their words rising above the fire, as if woven into the smoke. The conversation was incomprehensible to the others, but it felt ancient, like watching spirits of Rome speak through flesh under the American stars. Then the Apache switched to English. His voice was smooth, but it carried a gravity that anchored the camp like a mountain. "My grandfather," he said slowly, "was taken from the plains by missionaries. He was taught their language, their prayers, their world. He paused, scanning the circle of hardened faces. He taught it to my father, and my father taught it to me. But I do not use it to impress. I use it to remember what was stolen. The fire popped, sending embers swirling like ghosts. No one laughed now. No one dared. The cowboys, men who had seen gunfights, buried friends, and crossed deserts, now sat like children before a teacher. The night no longer belonged to them. It belonged to a man they had mocked, a man whose silence had been mistaken for ignorance. And yet, behind that silence had lived stories they could not begin to understand. The bishop, hands folded tightly, bowed his head, not out of habit or ceremony, but out of shame. "Forgive them," he whispered, barely audible. The Apache nodded, but not with softness, with dignity. "Forgiveness is not mine to give," he said. "It belongs to the land, to the ones buried beneath it." That statement sent a shiver down every spine. These weren't just words. They were echoes of pain carved deep into soil, into bloodlines. Buckshot, Bill tried to speak, to make light of the moment, but his voice cracked. "Didn't mean no harm," he muttered, avoiding the Apache's gaze. But harm had been done, not with bullets, but with ignorance, with assumptions that had cut just as deep. The Apache said nothing. He simply reached into his pouch and pulled out a thin, weathered book. It wasn't a Bible. It wasn't a tribal artifact. It was a Latin grammar book, edges worn, pages marked by generations of hands. "My grandfather copied this by candlelight," he explained. "When they wouldn't let him read their books, he memorized them instead. Then, when they finally let him learn, he wrote them down, word by word. And when he died, he made my father swear he'd never forget." He looked at the flames. "And I haven't." The book passed around the circle, trembling hands holding it as if it were made of glass. Cowboys who couldn't read their own contracts now stared at the elegance of an ancient tongue. The bishop leaned forward. "Why did you never speak before?" he asked. The Apache's gaze didn't waver. "Because you didn't ask," he said plainly. "You looked at me and saw a shadow. But a shadow only hides the truth if you turn your back to the light." Those words weren't just poetic. They struck like a thunderclap in a clear sky. Every man around the fire was forced to reckon not only with what they had seen, but what they had chosen not to see. As the fire dimmed, the stars above seemed to burn brighter, as if the heavens themselves were bearing witness. The cowboys, for all their grit and pride, were silent now, and not just from shock. They were learning that strength could wear silence, that wisdom didn't shout, and that the most powerful voice at the fire wasn't the loudest. It was the one they had tried to ignore. Morning in the desert comes without warning. One moment the world is cloaked in shadow, the next it blazes gold. The camp stirred slowly, not with the usual groans or laughter, but with silence that still clung from the night before. The cowboys moved like men returning from battle, not because they had fought, but because something inside them had been irrevocably altered. Their boots hit the dirt with hesitation. Their eyes met the Apache's with a new, quiet respect. No one dared joke. No one even asked what was for breakfast. Instead, they watched as the Apache walked toward the edge of the canyon, his back straight, steps calm. The bishop followed. He didn't command. He didn't bless. He just walked beside the man he had once pitied, now unsure who the teacher really was. There was something sacred in the way the Apache moved, not in robes or rituals, but in the stillness of someone who had endured more than he ever spoke of. "Why Latin?" the bishop asked finally. The Apache didn't turn. "Because it survives," he said. "Empires fall, kings die, faiths bend, but the words remain. You teach your children what survives." The bishop nodded slowly. "And what did your grandfather say about those who mocked him?" The Apache paused, then glanced at the rising sun. He said they were just men lost in their own noise. And that one day, silence would teach them. That morning, the cowboys didn't ride out as planned. They stayed. They listened. The Apache told stories, not all in Latin, not all in English, but in the rhythm of the West. He spoke of his people, of broken treaties, of a time when buffalo roamed without fear. He didn't ask for pity. He asked for ears. And for once, the men gave him that, fully, wholly. They leaned in like children, listening to legends passed down in firelight. By midday, the tone of the camp had changed. The laughter returned, but it was softer, more thoughtful. Men shared food without grumbling. One cowboy, the one who had laughed the loudest the night before, offered his only clean canteen to the Apache without a word. Respect was no longer demanded. It had been earned through truth, pain, and revelation. And the fire that had once burned with mockery now held something else entirely: humility. Later that afternoon, a stranger approached the camp, a bounty hunter by the look of him, rifle slung high, scars deep. His boots stomped hard into the dust, and his eyes scanned the men like prey. He asked for shelter, spoke little, and carried the scent of arrogance. The cowboys, not long ago so eager to boast and provoke, now stood cautiously, exchanging glances. It wasn't fear they felt. It was responsibility. They'd been changed, and they wouldn't let this man infect the fire they'd just begun to understand. The bounty hunter spotted the Apache near the horses and snorted. "You boys keeping pets now?" he said with a crooked grin. The air thickened immediately. No one laughed. No one replied. The Apache didn't move. He didn't need to. The silence of the others was louder than a shout. Even the bishop, now standing closer to the fire than to the cross on his chest, fixed the man with a look that made him flinch. Buckshot Bill stepped forward. Not with fists, but with words. "That man knows more than you ever will," he said flatly. "So mind your mouth, or ride on." The bounty hunter laughed, more out of discomfort than amusement. "You all gone soft or something?" he muttered. But his eyes didn't hold the same fire. He could sense the change, the unseen bond these men now shared, built not on bravado, but on respect carved from truth. The Apache finally turned, slowly. He walked to the fire, took a seat, and looked the bounty hunter squarely in the eye. Then, in Latin, he said a phrase none of the others understood, but the bishop did. His face went pale. He said, the bishop translated quietly, "Even the wildest horse can be taught to kneel." A chill rippled through the camp. The bounty hunter, for the first time, seemed unsure. He didn't reply. He simply walked back to his horse, mounted, and rode away. The cowboys watched him go without a word. Then, one by one, they returned to the fire. Something powerful had just happened, something unspoken. They didn't cheer. They didn't gloat. They just sat beside the man they had once mocked, now their silent center. And as the wind picked up, carrying dust across the plains, they understood. The West wasn't just about guns and gold. It was about honor. And sometimes, the quietest voice held the greatest weight. As dusk approached once more, the fire was lit again, not with the careless snapping of branches, but with quiet reverence. The men gathered closer than before, no longer just to keep warm, but to remain near the presence that had shifted their world. The Apache sat where he had the night before, unmoved, grounded like a stone that had seen centuries roll past. His eyes were fixed on the flames, yet he seemed to see far beyond them, into places the others couldn't reach. One of the older cowboys, a man named Doyle, cleared his throat. He'd buried 3 wives and outlived all his brothers, yet had never spoken much. "Do you still believe in their God?" he asked carefully. The Apache didn't answer right away. Instead, he tossed a handful of dried sage into the fire. The smoke spiraled upward, thin and white, like a prayer. "I believe in what speaks through silence," he finally said. "Sometimes it's your God. Sometimes it's mine. Truth doesn't wear a single robe." The bishop lowered his eyes. He had never heard anything so simple, yet so profound. In all his years delivering sermons, no scripture had pierced him like those few words. He realized then that his collar, his books, his rituals, they were not the only path to divinity. Around that fire, he felt closer to something holy than he had in any cathedral. And it came not from doctrine, but from a man whose people had been silenced, yet never broken. One of the youngest ranch hands, red-faced and shy, asked how he could learn to listen better. The Apache looked at him and said, "By first letting go of your need to speak." The boy nodded, as if he'd just been handed a key to a door he never knew existed. Around the fire, a sense of transformation took root. Men once shaped by harsh land and harder hearts were now softened by something older than the desert itself. Wisdom earned through suffering and passed on without pride. That night, no one sang. No one told jokes. They simply sat and watched the flames. And in that silence, They began to understand the land around them, its scars, its sacredness, its memory. They realized they had walked over graves without knowing, had spoken over truths they'd never tried to hear. But now, for the first time, they listened. And in that listening, they were no longer just cowboys. They were witnesses to something eternal. The next morning came slow and gold, as if the sun itself were reluctant to disturb the stillness of the camp. Birds fluttered through the sagebrush, and the horses grazed quietly near the creek. The Apache had risen before the others, standing barefoot in the red dirt, his face turned eastward. He murmured words in his native tongue, a prayer not for vengeance or glory, but for remembrance, for the world not to forget what it had taken, nor what it had left behind. The bishop joined him, standing beside him without speaking. When the Apache finished, he glanced at the older man. "Most think silence is empty," he said, "but in silence my ancestors speak. Can yours hear through it too?" The bishop blinked, caught between shame and revelation. "I think they're just now learning how," he whispered. And in that moment, the lines between races, creeds, and histories blurred like the horizon at dawn. After breakfast, the cowboys gathered their gear, but they didn't rush. Every action was slower, more deliberate. They saddled their horses not with groans and cursing, but with quiet purpose. Something sacred had settled in their bones. And when they looked at the Apache, they didn't see a quiet Indian anymore. They saw a bridge between worlds, between past and present, between ignorance and understanding. As they prepared to ride, Buckshot Bill approached the Apache and held out his old silver flask. It was dented, scratched, and nearly empty, but it was his prized possession. "Don't reckon I'll need this as much anymore," he said, offering it like a peace treaty. The Apache took it, nodded once, and tucked it gently into his bag. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The gesture spoke volumes. They rode out at noon. Dust rose behind them like smoke from a sacred fire. And though their backs were to the camp, their hearts were still near the flame that had changed everything. The desert stretched out before them, vast and endless, but for the first time, it didn't feel empty. It felt alive, ancient, and full of voices waiting to be heard. They rode for hours in near silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the rhythmic thump of hooves against dry earth. Conversation had changed, not gone, but refined. The men no longer filled the air with noise just to feel important. When they spoke, it was in fragments and reflections. They weren't just riding westward. They were carrying something invisible with them. A weight, yes, but also a gift. The kind of truth that changes a man without needing to shout. Midway through the day, they stopped by a ravine where cool water trickled over stones. The Apache crouched by the edge, whispering words into the current. One of the cowboys, Sam, who had once sworn he'd never trust an Indian, asked him softly, "What are you saying?" The Apache looked at him and replied, "Names." Sam frowned. "Whose?" The answer came like a stone dropped into deep water. The ones who were forgotten. The ravine fell still. No one asked more. The bishop, now walking beside his mule, told a story from his youth, about a time he was proud of converting a small village. But as he spoke, his voice faltered. "I thought I was saving souls," he said, "but maybe I was just trading their songs for silence." The Apache turned to him, not to rebuke, but to offer clarity. When a song is lost, it echoes in other hearts. You can't unburn the tree, but you can plant another. The bishop wept, quietly, the tears of a man finally seeing the cost of his calling. They camped that night by a grove of twisted trees, their branches shaped like hands reaching for rain. The Apache told a tale his grandfather once told, of a mountain that swallowed soldiers whole, not out of anger, but to protect the spirits they'd disturbed. The cowboys listened as if hearing myth for the first time. They didn't question the logic. They felt the truth in it. In the West, stories weren't just stories. They were the only maps some men had left. And as the stars blinked awake in the sky, the camp settled once more. But this time, the silence was different than before. It wasn't born from shame or shock. It was reverent, the kind of quiet you hold when standing in a place where something sacred has happened. They were no longer the same men who had sat by the fire, mocking a stranger. They were becoming something more, not saints, not sages, but men aware of their ignorance, and hungry now to learn. The following morning brought with it a strange omen, a hawk circling low, its shadow trailing across the ground like a ribbon of warning. The Apache watched it for a long time, his eyes squinting against the sun. "Storm's coming," he said. "Not the kind that soaks your clothes. The kind that soaks your soul." The others felt it too. The air was dry, but heavy. Even the horses stamped with unease. They reached a small outpost by midday. A trading post, 2 saloons, a church, and a jail. As they dismounted, eyes followed them. A cluster of townsfolk watched from porches and windows, their expressions guarded. When the Apache stepped into view, a woman pulled her child behind her skirt. The tension was sharp. The townspeople saw only what they'd been taught to see, a threat wrapped in silence. But the Cowboys didn't let the moment pass. Buckshot Bill, of all people, stepped forward. "He rides with us," he said loud enough for all to hear. "And he speaks with more wisdom than any preacher I've met." The bishop, standing just behind, nodded. "He speaks Latin," he added, "and truth." Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind in a dry field. The tension didn't vanish, but it shifted, confused now, not hostile. The sheriff emerged, a thick man with sun-wrinkled skin and a deep distrust in his eyes. "That's so," he grunted. "And what's he got to say for himself?" The Apache stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. He looked the sheriff in the eye and said in perfect Latin, "Veritas liberabit vos." The sheriff blinked, confused. The bishop translated, "The truth shall set you free." And for a brief moment, even the sheriff had no reply. Inside the saloon, as the group settled with water and stale bread, the piano stood untouched. The usual clamor was gone. The Apache sat in the corner, not isolated, but centered. Even the barkeep kept glancing at him, unsure whether to offer whiskey or a blessing. The bishop leaned in toward the group and said, "Do you feel it?" Sam asked, "Feel what?" The bishop smiled. The West changing. And deep down, they all knew something sacred had been stirred, and it wouldn't go quiet again. Later that day, a group of young men from town, full of cocky grins and untamed swagger, gathered outside the saloon. They hadn't witnessed the firelit confession, nor the silence it left behind. They only saw an Indian sitting where, in their minds, no Indian should sit. One of them, tall and sharp-toned, spat near the Apache's boots and barked, "This ain't your place." The words were loud enough to draw attention. Inside, forks stopped midair. Cups froze mid-lift. The Apache didn't rise. He simply looked at the boy with the weight of generations behind his eyes. The same look that had once silenced cowboys around a desert fire. One of the older men from the group tried to pull the boy back, sensing the shift in air. But pride is a powerful poison. The boy sneered and repeated, "I said, this ain't your place." The bishop stood slowly. Buckshot Bill and Sam followed. No weapons were drawn. None were needed. The Apache finally spoke. "You're right," he said calmly. "This was your place. Until you made it small." Confusion flashed across the boy's face. "What does that mean?" he asked, voice rising. The Apache replied, "A man's land isn't where he plants his boots. It's where he plants respect." That line struck the gathering crowd deeper than a bullet ever could. The boy opened his mouth, but nothing came. Just the sound of his own breath and the weight of 100 watching eyes. The townsfolk began to whisper. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was curiosity. The piano man, who hadn't played all day, slowly sat down and began to press the keys. Not a loud tune, but a soft one. Melancholy. Almost like an apology sung, without words. The Apache nodded once and turned back inside. The tension didn't dissolve entirely, but it changed. The town had tasted something ancient, something deeper than prejudice or pride. They just didn't have words for it yet. That night, in the room above the saloon, the bishop sat with his journal, scribbling furiously. He wrote not sermons, but memories, trying to capture the language of the land, the lessons hidden in silence, the parables that didn't come from holy books, but from campfires and quiet eyes. He looked out the window, down at the Apache sitting alone by the well. "That man," he whispered to himself, "carries more truth than I've read in 40 years." And for the first time in his life, he felt he might finally be ready to listen. The next morning, the Apache prepared to leave. He packed his saddlebag with simple things: dried herbs, his grandfather's Latin book, a small bundle wrapped in deer hide. No one asked where he was going. They knew better than to ask a man like him to explain. He was the kind of soul who belonged to the road, to the wind, to the spaces between stories. Yet none of them wanted him to go. Before he mounted his horse, Sam approached with something wrapped in cloth. "It's my old Bible," he said, handing it over. "Not much use to me till now. Figured maybe it could ride with someone who understands the silence between the lines." The Apache accepted it without a word and tucked it gently beside the Latin book. Two sacred texts, two worlds that had collided, not in violence, but in revelation. The bishop placed a hand on the Apache's shoulder. "You came in silence, and you leave us with voices we never knew we had." The Apache smiled faintly. "I didn't give you voices," he said. "I just showed you where they were buried." Then he mounted his horse and turned eastward, not west like most riders, but back toward the rising sun. A man walking into beginnings, not endings. As the horse trotted out of sight, the town remained still. Even the children were quiet, as if sensing that something holy had just passed through. Buckshot Bill took off his hat, something he rarely did unless burying a friend. "That man," he muttered, "he's got the West in his bones." And none of the others disagreed. For once, they all knew what it meant to ride beside a legend before it was named one. Long after he was gone, they would tell the story. Not about a shootout or a robbery or a lost mine, but about a quiet Apache who spoke Latin to a bishop by firelight. A man who reminded them that the most powerful words are often the ones spoken without force. That silence isn't the absence of story, it is the waiting room of truth. And that in the heart of the wild, where laws fade and legends rise, respect is the only currency that never runs dry. Out in the Old West, legends aren't always born with gunfire or gold. Sometimes they arrive quietly, with sand on their boots and stories in their silence. The tale of the Apache who spoke Latin didn't shake the land with thunder. It whispered through it like a sacred wind, reaching into hearts too proud to admit they'd forgotten how to listen. That night by the fire, and the days that followed, weren't about language. They were about recognition, of worth, of wisdom, of the soul behind the silence. Those cowboys, hardened by frontier life, discovered something no bullet could teach. They learned that true strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly, remembering. It waits for the right moment, not to attack, but to reveal. The Apache's Latin wasn't a performance. It was a mirror, one that forced each man to see himself not as the hero of every tale, but as someone who still had much to learn. And learning, they realized, begins with humility. The bishop, the cowboys, even the sheriff, they were all transformed. Not because they were told to change, but because they witnessed truth carried with grace. And isn't that what the West really is? A place not just of harsh terrain and hardened men, but of souls in search of meaning. Sometimes, the man you least expect holds the map you've needed all along. And sometimes, that map is written in a language you never thought to value. So now, as this story fades with the last glow of the fire, ask yourself, how many voices have you ignored simply because they didn't speak the way you expected? How many truths have gone unheard because they didn't come from someone who looked like you, talked like you, believed like you? In a world that still rushes to speak, perhaps the bravest thing we can do is listen. If this story moved you in any way, if it made you pause, reflect, or even look at the world just a little differently, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel so these stories keep finding you. Leave a comment below and share what stayed with you most. And if you believe silence holds power, give this video a like, not just for us, but for every voice that's been waiting to be heard.